our Horse Creek Farmer-led Watershed Council. The Horse Creek Council actually has farmer members who live on the lake as well. And so they were able to go to the board and say, this is what our project is doing. And this is how we as farmers are working with more farmers to create improvements. And the Lake Association was so impressed by that, they actually give $2,000 every year to the Horse Creek Farmer-led Watershed Council. The Watershed Council then takes that money, sets it aside, and creates special programs just so that they can feel like they are truly investing specifically in Cedar Lake. And we also invite them out to our field days so that, and our demonstration and education events, so that they can see what's going on and hear the discussion, which is often very in-depth and practical. And sometimes they leave those early going, yeah, I don't need to hear anything more about tractor settings or planter settings. Thank you very much. But it's at least the opportunity for them to understand practically what farmers have to go through in order to adopt these practices. So why conservation agriculture? I've been really impressed with the depth of conversation that we've had here over the past few days, but I wanted to cover it quickly. So I'm going to pull from one of my bigger watersheds, which is the red cedar. This is from their TMDL, which was created in 2015. As you can see, 40% of that watershed is in agriculture, either through row crops or pasture. However, when you look at the sources of phosphorus reaching that watershed, almost 70% is coming from agricultural sources. So with that in mind, if we leave the models, which we try to, and understanding there are other pollutant concerns as well, it's clear to us that agriculture is actually punching above its weight in terms of the amount of the watershed it takes up and the nutrients it's supplying to the watershed, the not so positive nutrients that it's supplying to the watershed. So with this in mind, we know that we need to do something about agriculture. The other thing that we can find in the TMDL is that no-till, which is a form of farming, as well as manure spreading and other things, barnyards, cover crops, are considered some of the top things that we can be doing. So agricultural practices are considered the most cost-effective way in many cases to reduce the nutrient loading to watersheds. So with all of this in mind, it's pretty clear to us that we need to start having more in-depth conversations about agriculture instead of focusing on point source pollutions. We need to have agricultural members and farmers as part of the conversations for reductions to the watershed. And as I said, it's relatively cost efficient. So what is conservation agriculture? This is the 101 portion of this. I will try not to spend too much time on it, but it is very important. Number one, minimizing mechanical disturbance of the soil. This is huge. It is also the most difficult. I'm a former employee of the NRCS. I'm an employee of the Wisconsin Farmers Union. Basically, every agricultural association has a plow or a hoe or something that mechanically disturbs soil to represent farming. Most of the farmers I work with, the first task they had on farm, aside from taking care of livestock, was pulling a tiller through the field. Tilling and plowing is considered part of the identity of farming. And we cannot overstate that, because I work with many farmers who say, I'm trying to go to no-till. I've been doing it for 10 years. It's great and it works. I do it every year and I look behind me and go, that's not going to work. That's not how plants grow. This isn't right. And then they say, you got to just leave. You got to go to the cabin for 2 weeks because that's not how plants grow. And you get back 2 weeks later, turns out plants can grow through this. But minimizing mechanical disturbance is considered one of the main principles of soil health and conservation agriculture. It's also one of the hardest to wrap your mind around. And as gardeners, we can all understand that too. The next principle is permanent soil organic cover. So keeping a living root in the ground as long as possible and keeping what we call residue on top of the ground as long as possible. This again goes against some of the principles that at least I grew up in Minnesota watching fields. They were black and powdery, right? That black soil was the sign of a healthy field and a good farmer. Unfortunately, that's not good for the soil, right? So conservation agriculture tells us that you want to leave the stubble where it is and you want to have a living root in the ground as long as possible. If you are in a corn on corn situation, which many farmers consider to be the most profitable crop they can grow, that means that you only have about, at most, 112 days of living root in the ground. So less than a third of the year is actually in cover that's alive with a traditional system. So the way that we counteract that is to provide a cover crop, which is a special number of plants that's just planted only for the benefit of the soil. It is not harvested for any other reason in most cases, and it's a big cost to farmers. But for farmers who are taking seriously soil health and concerned about erosion and other measures, it's the number one thing they can do. The third thing is actually the most difficult, which is surprising because the other two are very difficult, but it's species diversification. So this includes, as we all know, here in the Midwest, corn and soybeans is considered the main rotation. I come from Minnesota, 80% of southern Minnesota, including all Mass, all lakes, cities, and everything, and rooftops. If you look down, 80% is corn and soybeans. It is a huge, huge part of our market. It's also not very diverse. Some farmers are just corn and corn and corn and corn. So corn and soybeans to them seems like a conservation rotation, but species diversification in a real ecosystem means 5 to 6 to 20 to 100 species, right? And so adding in more diverse species within the year or within multiple years of a rotation, or even incorporating livestock is considered the third principle. And it's extraordinarily hard. I'll get to some of those reasons if I don't run out of time. So I wanted to talk about what farmers are doing. To do that, we could tell you, and we've got many people here who work on projects to talk about what we try to get them to do. But we did a survey of every farmer we could identify in my 4 watersheds on guys who are working over 80 acres, what they actually do. So we mailed them all surveys. If they didn't respond, we mailed them again. We had a relatively high response rate, just around 40%. And here's what we found. Number one, grass waterways are extraordinarily effective at erosion control and highly adopted. 94% of the farmers that we asked are using grass waterways or buffers to control erosion on their fields. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, it was brought up in the last session I was in. These green spots in the field, these are actually graded areas that are designed just to prevent erosion and stop washouts on field. So the farmer has made the choice to take this land out of production, and it is solely there to act as a conservation measure. When I was a kid, we did not see these in fields nearly to the level. Wisconsin is certainly farther along than Minnesota in this, but grass waterways are a huge benefit to us. And over half of the respondents that wrote into us did not receive cost sharing for the practices of buffers that they're using. So our county land conservation districts, woot woot, you guys are doing an amazing job, but many of our farmers just took that principle and they're doing it themselves. We also saw that 97% of the farmers that we surveyed are actually using soil testing. This is also significantly different than it was 20 years ago, where the farmers are going out grid surveys of their fields, between about every 4 and 5 acres. They put a probe in the ground, pull up a soil sample, put it in a bag, mail it to a lab, and the lab tells them how much nutrient is already there. The goal of this is that the farmer can then not over apply nutrient. Is that always happening? No, but at least we have high adoption of farmers understanding that they don't want to be wasting their nutrients, and they're trying to be as efficient as they can. Now, these stats that I found here were given to me by a farmer. The farmer actually took a picture of a slide and the slide was given by a Winfield, which is a farm tech company. And it's interesting to see what happens in rooms that only have farmers in them that the industry tells back to farmers about how great they are. And this is what they were told. Farmers have cut erosion by 67% in the last 30 years. They've reduced irrigation by 53%. We see good numbers on greenhouse gases, energy per bushel, and they've increased production by 101%. This is interesting because the farmers are going, great, look at how we're feeding the world, 101% increase of production. However, all of these numbers are based on per bushel, right? So even though they've reduced per bushel the amount of sediment, if you're increasing by over 100% the number of bushels, we are still seeing a higher level of erosion, more greenhouse gases, and all the other things. These numbers actually came from the Field to Market report. I questioned them at first. I was like, yeah, the Farm Bureau might think that. And oh, I see, well, Environmental Defense Fund and Farmers for Sustainability, maybe. Then we had Mondelez and some other big companies. And then I saw Wisconsin Farmers Union was also, and I was like, oh, these numbers are real then. The other part, aside from surveying the farmers, We actually, and thank you so much to the Polk County staff for doing this. They do a transect survey every year. And beyond doing a general transect survey, they look at every field they can see in our Horse Creek watershed from the road, which is a huge investment of their time. And they do it twice so they can see no-till and also cover crop use. Based on that, last year, 19% of the fields in the Horse Creek watershed were in no-till systems and 14% went on cover crops. That is higher than the Midwest average, which is reported to be 8%. Now, we are really heartened by these numbers and we're happy to see them. We also are seeing generally an upward growth of adoption of those two main keystone practices, which we're happy to see. However, there's plenty of room for improvement. If 1 in 5 acres are in no-till, that means 4 out of 5 acres are not. This picture was taken by one of my colleagues. It's about 300 feet downstream from a cattle operation in the ditch. We are still seeing plenty of sediment loss. And this, I also wanted to show, this is what we could be seeing. We're happy with the farmers who are doing adoption, but this is not necessarily the standard for what we see around here. The next thing in our survey asked was, how do farmers feel about conservation? So in that survey, we asked them, do you agree with the statement that farmers have a responsibility to minimize erosion from their fields? And 87% of the farmers strongly agreed with that statement, and 0 of them disagreed. So I want to bring this home, that there are no farmers out there who are saying that they are not responsible for stewardship. They all agreed that they were. 100% of them had a positive response personally to the phrase soil health. We feel really good about this, and that's why you will always hear me say soil health. We compared it to sustainability, we compared it to conservation. Some of those had relatively high numbers, but 100% felt good about the phrase soil health. Interestingly, every response was lower than what they thought their neighbors felt about that. So only 90%, I'm sorry, I just lasered you. Only 90% of them thought that their neighbors had a positive inclination toward the phrase soil health. And that was true for every environmental paraphrasing word that we came up with. The most common answer when we asked them how the landowners that they rent from felt about conservation was not to answer, which also told us a lot in that our farmers are not having conversations with their non-operating landowners about what the expectations of conservation are. And when I talk to landowners, they often say, I'm just going to let the farmer decide. He knows what's actually going on. And when I talk to the farmers, they say, I don't know if the landowner would be comfortable with that. And I don't know if I'll be managing this field in 5 years. So I don't really want to make investments that aren't going to pay back within a year. So if anybody here is renting land, please have a conversation with me because your opinion matters. And when we asked farmers what we should be doing with the funds that we do have through farmer-led councils, they wanted to pay farmers for actions, which is what we're already doing. And 16% said spend more money on education of farmers. But most farmers agree that the conservation activities that we see are expensive and hard, and we should be paying them for trying. So all of that conservation agriculture stuff, we have the principles and we know what it looks like and we know what the adoption is. I wanted to go through the known benefits because I'm going to talk quickly about the hard things about it. But we do see the farmers who have adopted these talk very consistently about soil resiliency and the microbiome to deal with major stressors. So drought resilience and flood resilience are both outcomes of soil health practices. And that is huge considering the major fluctuations that our farmers all acknowledge are happening within the weather that they're getting. Erosion and sediment control, again, that's flood control, but it's also a huge reason that many of our farmers start adopting these practices. They are tired of watching their soil leave their fields. They know it matters. Water quality protection is also part of that, and everybody here in the room can understand the major components of that. Also, reducing their input costs. Now, this is not always the case. It does not always happen right away, but many of our farmers feel that they are able to more efficiently use fertilizer and use less herbicide because they are taking on these practices. This is the goal. It is hard to get to, but farmers who are able to consistently practice this and fully invest are able to see this. We also have livestock farmers who are able to utilize more forage options when they have cover crops and they have more flexibility, which is huge for them, but not available to many farmers as fewer and fewer have livestock on their land. And then the other major benefit of this conservation agriculture, which our farmers all acknowledge is true, although many of them do not care about carbon sequestration, is that as you have more plants open for more points of the year, and as you are not tilling up carbon out of the soil, we're actually sequestering carbon and reducing the carbon bank in the atmosphere. So all farmers agree that if climate change is real, these conservation agriculture principles will help climate change. All farmers I know agree that the climate and weather that they're getting is different. Beyond that and the next steps, those are not agreed upon. So we do not talk about climate change because we have enough other benefits and reasons to do this work. So why, as I said, are 4 out of 5 acres not in these major pillars of conservation, those major mechanical disturbance, living cover, and diversity? Number one excuse is that doesn't work here. Sometimes that doesn't work on my farm, that works on my neighbor's farm. I talked to farmers for the first year I worked. Why don't you do that? No-till doesn't work here. We're too cold. That works in Iowa. My dad happens to be from Iowa, so I called up his niece, my cousin, who runs about 1,000 acres there. And I said, how do people feel about no-till? And she said, if you say no-till in my county, you had better duck. I said, why? Well, everybody froze out and they had to replant. No-till works in Nebraska. I was like, oh, okay. So it works everywhere that's not here. And it doesn't matter how close here is because they can be doing no-till right across the field and the farmer will still say it doesn't work. There are also plenty of farmers who tried this stuff in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, and they didn't have great experiences with it. Now, if you have a bad experience, you're likely to tell 8 people about that bad experience. If you have a good experience, you might tell 1 person if they ask you about it. So if we have farmers who have had a failure when they tried something new for 1 year, they were very likely to tell their neighbors about the negative impact of that on them. From that, we get these ideas of anecdotes of other people's failures and a fear of adopting a new practice. We also hear farmers say, where do you get that from? Or my equipment won't do that, those planters are expensive, or I'm 65. I think that planter would do that. That new planter is $150,000. At this point in my career, I will not be buying a new planter, they will say. Or there are constraints with all sorts of other issues with this. So there are fair excuses of logistics to deal with that. I do think that the underlying issues here are a limited proof of local success because change is scary. Marketing constraints is also a really big deal here, especially when we're talking about that diversification factor. I have guys in Minnesota who are growing oats. They're doing amazing things with it. They're getting more profit. Oats are every inch of the field instead of in rows. And so that's a much better root system. It's adding diversity. It's adding resilience, lots of great things. They have to haul those oats to Iowa in order to be able to sell it at all. So when you can sell corn to the ethanol plant 15 miles away and only pay trucking costs for that, and you know how that goes, and that guy is your neighbor, and everybody around you knows where to market it, and if they can't take it in Boyceville 15 miles away, they can for sure take it 20 miles away in Menominee. So if you have that much marketing infrastructure around you for only 2 crops, and you have to go 1,500 miles for any other crop at all, that is a huge constraint for our farmers. Change is scary, as I said. Debt constraints is also working with bankers. Most farmers have to be in an annual rotation of debt cycles, if not a consistent rotation. If anybody was at the event yesterday that we had on farmers, one of our farmers said he was leveraged so far into debt that they were not going to be able to do anything if they didn't change something. And so luckily, he was able to work with his bankers and take on regenerative practices to turn his whole practice around. Most farmers and most bankers, however, are not excited about watching a farm change its practices into something that's not proven and is not the culture of the area, right? It's a risk, and having to even set that up to explain it to your banker can be a huge challenge. I used to work for a local newspaper, and I ended up at a Chamber of Commerce event, and I asked the banker who was in charge of loans to farmers, do you have any guys who are like doing a diverse crop rotation? And he said, oh yeah, I have some dairies that are growing their own corn. So to him, diversity in farming as a banker who makes ag loans was farmers growing crops that feed their livestock. And the crop he mentioned was the #1 crop that we have in the Midwest. The other thing, I already explained the limited supply and equipment constraints. This, I think, is the most important thing that we need to talk about. It's exhaustion by the farmer and antipathy. So number one, that exhaustion factor cannot be overstated. I have lots of farmers in my family, and I can tell you that a farm is a baby. It takes all night to worry about and all day, every day. If you are not worrying about it, you have to pay somebody else to worry about it every day of the year. If anybody in here has ever been a mother or had a baby that they were in charge of caring for as the primary person, you might remember back to having a baby and being sleep deprived. And if someone had approached you at that time when your focus was on keeping a newborn infant alive and said, we are going to change your entire diet so that you are healthier, it will be better for you, it will be better for your community. All you're going to have to do is change the way that you buy food and the way that you cook food and everything that you buy, but it will be better. And you'll say, I just want to go to sleep. Would you take the baby? and we can maybe talk about that conversation later because I would like to sleep. I think that is the same conversation we are asking a lot of farmers to have, is if we are asking them to take major changes of the way that they manage their farm, whether or not it's better in the long run, it's still an enormous ask. I also want to touch base on antipathy. So antipathy is kind of the opposite of empathy, right? And it comes from the sense that farmers are not interested in hearing from people who are not farmers. So as an example of this, St. Croix 360, they write amazing articles on the St. Croix River system, and they talk about everything that's happening there. One of the stories that they published in 2021 was about how a large dairy was doing a lot in order to manage their manure responsibly in terms of growing cover crops, which are pictured here, and doing no-till systems and responsible management of the manure. I read the article 3 hours after it had been published, and then I read the comments, of which there were 3. Number 1 was awesome work. Thanks, author, for writing this. Number 2 was great story. Number 3, horrific operation. Factory farming has killed this planet, and now a hog CAFO as well. So this commenter brought in a complaint about another farm that they didn't want entering the area. And they called this farm a horrific operation and then said, farming has killed this planet. Now, both my parents were independent business owners, and I cannot imagine how I would have felt if my parents' business had been called any of these things online. I also know that if there was an article written about me, I would have read it and I would have read the comments. The farmer who was focused on this, and I hear farmers routinely say they are not interested in sticking their head out. They do not want to talk to the public. They do not want to interact with people who aren't farmers because they are not understood. If this is happening, and I have heard this being said out loud to farmers, farmers are not interested in hearing anybody who says that they care about the environment. It is actually the hardest part of my job, dealing with farmers and proving to them that I care about them, because they are so used to having people come to them and tell them about the environment and why they're bad and what we need to do. I recently heard Glennon Doyle say that you should not take criticism from anybody who is happy to give it. If you are happy to give criticism to a farmer and tell them what they're doing is wrong, they should not listen to you. You want to hear from people who have your best interest at heart. If this is being said and we are not inoculating it by being better people than this, the thing that is happening is we are telling that farmer something he is going to tell every other farmer that he works with happened to him. And when I sit down, or the version of me in 20 years sits down with that farmer, he's still going to talk about it. I have farmers telling me about stuff that happened to them in 2020 or the 1990s. This matters. And if we approach conversations without respect, we are creating divisions that will not be salvaged easily. That experience is common enough that the agricultural industry does capitalize on it. So this lobbying group that works for confined animal feeding operations recently took some nitrate research and wrote a press release based on it without a scientist actually telling them what the research meant. And they said, this research doesn't fit the narrative environmental activists try to drive. All they were interested in results, not appeasing the mob. So this was published in a farmer-facing publication that farmers would read. The other one was published for environmentalists to read. So farmers are taking this information in from the public, and then the industry that loves them and goes out to their farm in polo shirts and tries to sell them stuff is telling them this routinely. So not only are they feeling attacked from one side, they're being met with open arms by an industry that's trying to sell them chemical. So we need to be aware of all of these factors when we're trying to communicate with farmers. And we need to be aware of why there might be some antipathy when farmers are receiving us into their spaces. So this gets to my very natural picture of an orange. I am really fortunate to work with my farmer-led councils, and I like to say that we have actually never held a vote in the 2 years that I've been working with these 4 councils through dozens of council meetings. We don't have standing boards. There are farmer leaders who have to be on the paperwork, but you would not be able to identify them in the room. They're there, but you couldn't tell just walking in and looking who is the leader. We work with collaboration. This is different than working with compromise. So in compromise, everybody has to give up something that they want, right? So let's say you have an orange and you have 2 kids and each kid wants an orange. What is the solution to that problem? Cut in half, King Solomon the orange, yes? Now, in that scenario, both people wanted an orange, a whole orange, and neither person got what they wanted, right? However, if you take the time to talk to people and say, well, what do you want an orange for? And they say, I want the peel because I saw this cool crap that you can do and make a candle with an orange peel. And the other person says, I want a cup of juice. You could actually have met both of those people's needs if you had taken the extra time to say, why do you want that? Now, I think my reaction to that as a snarky audience member would be, yeah, but most people just want to eat an orange, right? In that case, I would say, we are farmers, so let's grow more oranges. And also, oh, can we go back one? Or maybe not, never mind, my other slide got removed. Also, in the case of environmental stewardship and farming, there are no farmers who want to pollute water. And I should hope that there are no people here who don't want to have farms on the landscape. We have to grow food. We have to have these small businesses continue to work for rural America to keep functioning. And so if we understand that nobody here wants the other person to lose something, then we have to understand there have to be opportunities for compromise, which gets us back to soil health and conservation agriculture. As I said, 100% of farmers feel positive about these principles in soil health. So how can we deal with that? These are the 43 farmer-led watershed councils across Wisconsin. This circle here are the 4 that I am fortunate to work with in northwestern Wisconsin. Their goal is to improve soil and water quality by increasing implemented practices of the farmers. I covered this yesterday. I don't want to beat a dead drum. I know some of you have seen me speak before. Our farmers get together to learn and network with other farmers, number 1. That is who they trust, and that's who they want to learn from. Number 2, when I ask farmers, why are you here? They will tell me about a specific storm. In 2017, I got 5 inches in 3 hours. I walked my fields the next day and I said, I can't do this anymore. The weather is telling farmers they need to do something differently. What we have to do is grease the tracks. Number 3, farmers want to show non-farmers that they are being stewards. They are actually out on the land every day. They know what the weather is doing. They know how their crops are affected, and they know farms best. So they want to be able to talk as a unit to non-farmers to stop some of those negative interactions that we are seeing happen. And number 4, this used to be in smaller text because a main reason that farmers join is they want to prevent onerous regulation from happening. Most people acknowledge that nitrogen and phosphorus regulations are going to come. However, voluntary adoption and control of nitrogen and phosphorus on farms is the most economically efficient way to do it. Is going to mean that we have the highest level of adoption if it's considered a value by farmers, and is going to make sure it actually happens instead of being flipped back and forth based on political wins. So they want to solve the problem themselves through practical, effective, and flexible ways, instead of waiting for someone from Madison or Washington, D.C. to tell them how they ought to do it. Next slide. Yeah. So in 2022 alone, my 4 farmer-led councils provided incentives to different farmers for different practices. My wonderful local county land conservation departments then took all of those practices and modeled the reductions of sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus that came off of fields. I want to remind you that these numbers are only what we directly paid farmers for. Many of our farmers did not apply for all of the acres that they were doing because they didn't want to steal funds from other farmers. They wanted to keep the funds open. Also, not all of their acres could be because many of we ran out of money and they still kept doing the practices. So they would just go to the cap of, I can only get paid for 50 acres, but I actually did 2,000. But directly what we paid for last year was 4,200 pounds of nitrogen kept out of stream banks and waterways. 3,500 pounds of phosphorus, which if you times that by 500 is like 1.5 million pounds of algae kept out of lakes and waters, and 2,100 tons of sediment, which is about 2 million pounds. So we feel that we have been effective through relatively limited costs, relatively minimal resources in getting farmers to talk between each other and actually create differences. So I wanted to quickly go through how non-farmers can help. Although I'm getting a 2-minute warning here. If you are a landowner, talk to your farmer if they're a renter about conservation practices and tell them that you care about it because it really matters. Enter conversations with farmers respectfully. I know I kind of touched on this before, but it could not be more important. Otherwise, if you are not respectful in these conversations, you are pulling us upstream. You're not helping anything. Next one is make conscious food purchases. At the end of the day, most farmers feel that they are supplying food to America. There's also fuel and there's also fiber in them. But number one, farmers feel that they are creating food and feeding people. With that in mind, buy local meat. There is nothing better that you can do for your water than have a pasture-raised beef producer who's within the watershed. Purchase a CSA membership, eat at local food restaurants, and also please eat more diverse grains. The more diversity of grains, the more small grains I can get marketed. So if we can, I had one farmer say the best thing we could do is to have a Cheerios plant in Menominee, because then I could sell my oats. We need people to eat more diverse grains. And then again, support the programs that support conservation. DATCAP is huge into providing funds to us. That's the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. The EPA and regulations that give us the data and modeling that we need to know where we need to go. The USDA efforts affect everything in farming and marketing, and the NRCS is part of the USDA and a great partner for us. So that is the main ways that you can help as a non-farmer to enter this conversation and enhance conservation agriculture. That is my whole gist of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Please feel free to contact me via email, call, or text me. I'm happy to answer questions later or anything, but yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to listen. I'll be around just for a few minutes. Yeah. You're saying you think it's a little less than 66% of what? Here? So you think there's less than 66% cropland in the watershed because of the expanding? Yeah, and that's just, it really depends on the watershed that you're in. So here, these numbers are not too terribly different in the Hay River specifically, just because it's not urbanizing very quickly. But for example, in my dry run watershed, which is on the outskirts of Hudson, Wisconsin, yeah, it's changing really drastically every year. I'm taking one more. Yeah, you're not wrong. I actually work with one guy and I said, why do you suppose that the salesmen are recommending a higher rate than the university? And he said, oh, I don't know. I said, do you think maybe it's the fox guarding the hen house? But yes, I was really, really fortunate 2 weeks ago to end up in the room with a group that a local consultant agronomist just got together, and he got all of the men selling biologicals in the Northwest Territory that he knew together in a room. And they said, the future is in regenerative agriculture. He said that's the gold standard. So more and more as the next generation of agronomists are coming through, they are taking really seriously the needs of conservation and efficiency of use. But it's still hit and miss on who you're talking to or what they might be saying. And frankly, a lot of the people who are determining how much they apply are asking the person who sold them the product and makes a kickback for every pound that they sell. So we are making headway, but it is a real concern. Thank you so much.
We now have a 10-minute break, so at 2:35, we'll be back in this room. Thank you.